Buongiorno. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce our third keynote speaker for this conference. More mic? More mic. Like this? Better? Okay, great. Our third keynote speaker for the conference, Franca Cavagnoli. And we are, again, in the presence of a multi-talented, multi-tasking person. Franca is a published author. She has written 3 novels. Her third one is just about to be published. She has also produced 2 scholarly volumes on translation, has edited 2 collections of Australian short stories, Il cielo a rovescio and Cieli Australi, Cent'anni di racconti dall'Australia, as well as the complete collection of Catherine Manfield's short stories. She's written many articles and reviews. She lectures in translation studies at the Università degli Studi di Milano and at the Università degli Studi di Pisa. And she's been working as a literary translation for leading Italian publishers since 1987. And just to give you a taste of the sort of work she's done, amongst the authors she has translated are Nadine Gordimer, J.M. Coetzee, David Malouf, and Toni Morrison. She has been awarded prestigious prizes for her translation work, and most recently the Premio Gregor von Rezzori for her new translation of The Great Gatsby, which I haven't read, but I am now going to make sure I do. And I only found out last night that she's currently working on her 4th novel, which is to be her Australian novel. So we will look forward to reading that in due course. Today she's going to be talking to us about the relationship between authors and translators. And I won't take away any more time from Franca, so we welcome you warmly.
Good morning. It's a great honor to be here. And I would like to thank Rita Wilson and Ray Francis and Monash University for inviting me here. As editor for Einaudi of the Italian editions of works by some of France's greatest authors, including Alain Robbe-Crier, Michel Tournier, Hector Bianciotti, Eugène Ionesco, and Nathalie Sarraute, Gabriella Bosco has often asked them, "What do you think of literary translation?" The answers she received were wide-ranging and often varied radically from one another. The most interesting reply came from Julien Green, who was perfectly bilingual. He said, "Translation does not exist. The passage from one language to another always leads to transformation." "When I read my books translated into Italian," said Green, "I find that they are better. Kind of like when I look at a nude painting and then look at it from behind a glass pane. I find that it has changed for the better." Green had lived in Italy, so he knew Italian and was able to judge the quality of the translations of his books. According to Green, quote, "The glass pane becomes particularly appreciable when the translator is a writer. In other words, someone who makes a living writing novels and translates occasionally as a test piece or rhetorical exercise." When Einaudi commissioned Gabriella Bosco to edit the new Italian bilingual edition of Vercors, Le silence de la mer, Bosco knew that republishing Natalia Ginzburg's translation would mean giving a new platform to the Italian writer's heavy-handed translation. One of the book's characters, the German officer Werner von Ebrenack, speaks proper French because he is well-read and has a deep love for France and French culture. The character walks the line between his own civility and the barbarian nature of his role in history. While Vercors has his characters speak in proper French, the language attributed to him does contain expressive discordances, not mistakes, discordances. While they are not grammatical or syntactical errors per se, Vercors chooses not to ridicule the foreign character occupying his country. They are indicative of the character's manner. For example, when he says that he likes his host's house more than the castle he was initially supposed to stay in, the officer says, "Ici, c'est beaucoup plus beau château." Ginsburg chose not to translate the slight monk that disturbs the French, and instead translates, "Questo castello qui è molto meglio." Roughly, this castle here is much better. Bosco concludes that there are numerous instances in which Ginsburg decides to rationalize her translation choices. Perhaps in this case, the text would have benefited from a cloudier glass pane. Translating is not just an exercise in the restoration of meaning. The translator's true challenge lies in restoring meaning while trying to convey as much as possible the way in which that meaning is expressed. The translator should draw on every last drop of the source text to highlight what Aldo Busi calls the unrepeatable aesthetic modulation of the text, without being limited to simply making the content of the text understandable. To accomplish this task, the translator must labor hard on the letter, as this is the only way to receive the foreign without naturalizing it or assimilating it. This way, the translator can also profoundly transform the translating language on one side, and also has a chance to deeply modify the translator's own parole. The question to me is, why did Natalia Ginsburg decide not to translate the monk that mars the German officer's French? To make the translation easier to read as a result of hypercorrection, out of her annoyance with the character, or perhaps out of empathy for him. Because translation is a form of interpretation, as Eco always reminds us, justly, by the way, the first hurdle the translator, as a reader laden with responsibility, must face is reading the text and realizing how she or he perceives it. The act of reading in itself results in an initial form of translation. The reader transforms the verbal written text into mental language. This type of translation occurs even when one reads a text in one's own mother tongue. This is an example of an intersemiotic translation, since mental language is not a natural code. Thought formulates into an internal code that creates a discourse that can be understood only inside the mind. And according to Peirce, when we read, we produce a series of interpretants. The interpretant is a psychic sign and is highly subjective, tightly linked to the experience of the reader through words and, naturally, through the concepts, feelings, sensations associated to certain words. Because the language we think in is not a natural code, but rather, like the language in which we dream, is a multimedia language, the image conjured up in the reader's mind might not be the same as the one created in the authors. In the case of an interlingual translation, the problem becomes even more complex since a graphic sign must be found in another language. If, for example, in the novel of an Australian author, we read the description of a tea tree along the banks of a river, the image created in the mind of an Australian reader, melaleuca, will be vastly different to the one created in the mind of a British reader, maybe tea plant. If the translator is unaware of this difference, and in this case we would be justified to speak of biodiversity, when moving on to the second phase of the translation process, in other words, when translators translate from their own mental language to the code of the translated text, something will be lost, inevitably, and in all likelihood, an incorrect translation will be produced. In Italian, albero del tè. The question becomes even more complicated if we imagine a situation that is less clear-cut. If in the source text we find the expression un vaso di fiori, a vase of flowers, and the translator visualizes, while reading un vaso di fiori, for example, daisies, while still providing a correct and generic translation, a vase of flowers and not a vase of daisies, how the expression is perceived might be strongly influenced by the idea of a vase of daisies and everything the daisies conjure up within the translator. They might evoke childhood nostalgia and call to mind fields of daisies where the translator played happily, or maybe evoke annoyance because they bring up bad memories. Any ambiguous or ambivalent adjectives found in the text might be the ones to pay the price, and our interpretant might influence how we read those adjectives. It is often thought that errors in translation are due to a lack of knowledge of the foreign language, of one's native language, or of the cultural context. And although this is often the case, more often than not, these errors occur because there is no correspondent between the author's interpretant and the translator's interpretant. For this reason, submitting one's translation for multiple readings upon completion and accepting feedback can be useful to identifying these psychic interferences and thus circumventing one of the biggest dangers lurking in the treacherous waters of translation. A good share of translation loss is due to this double translation that takes place in the mind and of which translators are largely unaware. This place where it is easy to lose a part of the message and become completely lost is unconscious. As in every reading process, the translator's mind plays an active part in interpreting the text and often does so unconsciously. It is therefore inevitable that during the interpretation process, translators are influenced by their own personal story, made up of feelings, memories, affections, traumas, slips of the tongue. It is also inevitable that the translator will unconsciously manipulate the text. At this time, I prefer not to speak of conscious, external, or ideological manipulation. Translators who decide to tackle a literary text have, in my opinion, very few tools with which to counteract their unconscious. The translator can only be aware of this and hope that a greater awareness will unconsciously align itself with the need to produce a translation that accomplishes the ethical aim of the translating act, that of receiving the foreign, as Antoine Bermond reminds us. It is not to assimilate, not to naturalize the foreign, but receive it as such. And if we think of the foreign not with the meaning of strange to us, but a person coming from another country, that would be not to assimilate him or not to naturalize him. As already stated, translation is a form of interpretation, but I would add it's also a form of writing. The translating act is not merely limited to two natural tongues, but also engages two languages: the language of the writer, that is, the writer's parole, and the language of the translator's parole. And yet all translators are potential writers, writers who choose to write the books of others in their own mother tongue. There is no difference between translators and writers who publish their own books and who translate the books of the others. Both often carry inside themselves the books they would like to write or haven't yet written. The interference of one's own narrative world, of one's own imaginary world, can be quite invasive. The risk of overlapping one's own subjectivity and one's own writing looms large. In this case, translators should keep their narrative language from overlapping with the writers. This dynamic is even more subtle than a cultural overlap between the self and the other. While translators may be aware of this dynamic during the translating act, that is the cultural, in cultural terms, they are not always aware of the dialectic between the self and the other in terms of imagination, the imagination of the writer, the imagination of the translator. In terms of the concept of writing, of interpretants that may differ and conflict with each other. Any overlapping in this sense can significantly damage the fabric of the translated text. It is therefore necessary to create within oneself a place to receive, a sort of framezzo, an in-between place, an in-between space, a third space, between the translator's own imaginary world and that of the writer, an uncomfortable but necessary place in which to work. The most interesting aspect of this framezzo comes from the foreign element that encourages translators to question their own knowledge. Translators are all too often imprisoned within their family sayings. And here we return to Natalia Ginzburg, and a complacent mental grammar. Only this way can translators test their ability to create something new for themselves and for their own language. This doesn't mean forcing their native language in an unnatural way by creating elementary calques or falling victim to false friends, but rather broadening their own linguistic and cultural horizons, and hence those of the future readers of the book they're working on. It is in this place that one must test oneself and proceed through trial and error throughout the entire translation. Just like being aware of the inevitability of translation loss and accept it, it's inevitable, translation loss. Just like being aware of this makes it possible to translate, being aware of having to err in the sense of making mistakes as well as of straying in an uncomfortable place makes it possible to find something that partly makes up for what gets lost. My experience as a writer and a translator has taught me that if the subsystem of translated literature occupies a place of prominence within a given country's literary policy system, as in the case of Italy, then the translation activity takes part in the creation of new models. In this kind of situation, the translator's main concern is not to seek out conventional models and hence to stick to the rules set out by the publishing industry. In fact, the translator can be more daring and violate the system's conventions. In Evin Tsoa's words, under such conditions, the chances that the translation will be close to the original in terms of adequacy, in other words, a reproduction of the dominant textual relations of the original, are greater than otherwise. All the more reason why the writer-translator should, in my view, go against the convention of the system and in so doing set a good example. It is the duty of the writer-translator as it is the duty of the intellectual, in Said's words, not to respond to the logic of the conventional, but to the audacity of daring. If the translator is intrepid and daring, the cultural baggage and the aesthetic modulation of an entire country reap the benefits. As a writer and translator, the dialectic between the two ways of writing, the two personal paroles, and two imaginary worlds of the author and of the writer-translator, and not only between two natural tongues and two cultural systems, is a problem that I'm particularly sensitive to. I believe the writer's-translator's narrative language must not superimpose the translated authors. Translator-writers must hand over their pen, so to speak. We're prompted by our sense of responsibility towards ourselves and the work we have chosen to do, but also towards both the author and the reader. Writer-translators should be careful not to assimilate the other or project on the other their own idiosyncrasies, their own allergic hypersensitivity to adjectives and nouns, their own distaste for certain punctuation, making their own writing dominant and the other subaltern. By shifting attention away from themselves to the object of their work, writer-translators can intervene authoritatively in the translation process and place their own authorial skills at the service of the other's authorship. To translate is not to overinterpret, to adapt, or to appropriate what belongs to the other. If, as in the case of many writers, for someone, in Adorno's words, who no longer has a homeland, writing becomes a place to live, this would mean appropriating their home. The result being that of forcing the person into the precarious condition of an unhomed migrant, as Homi Bhabha would say, or a migrante scasato, the term I like to use to translate Bhabha's expression, with inspiration from Bacchelli, Pascoli, and Pirandello, who were very fond of the verb scasare, in its various connotations of being homeless, being evicted, being sent packing, moving. Quando uno scasato cerca podere, writes Pascoli, we might say when an unhomed person seeks a farm and a field, he or she is welcomed in one's own land, in literature as in life. In no instance should a writer-translator claim the right to exclusively dispose of which belongs to another. This way the writer-translator appropriates. It's an appropriation of something that belongs to someone else, evicting someone from their home. And this is according to Berman, as referred to literary translation, and according to me, in general, I would say, an unethical gesture. The gesture of the writer who translates must be authoritative, not authoritarian. An excellent example of how the writer-translator can authoritatively undertake the translation process by putting one's own inventive talents at the service of the authorship of another is provided by Aldo Busi, who in 1988 translated for Garzanti Christina Stead's 7 Poor Men of Sydney. The translated passage I will comment on clearly demonstrates that Busi's emotional intelligence, as opposed to his speculative intelligence, enables him to vividly adhere and participate with creative energy to Stead's written word. In an unfinished essay written in the appendix of the translation of Shakespeare's sonnets, and by the way, he only translated as far as sonnet 103, he likes uncompleted works. Busi writes, "In the sea of knowledge, in which two shores face one another, but are remote, and each, in fact, is often dislocated too far above or too far below any ideal and conventional comfort zone, geographic, historical, linguistic, and rhetorical, one can never go beyond the fact that gain is implicit in loss, and loss is implicit in gain." Busi's view on translation is lucid, as evidenced by the fact that he acknowledges that gain is inevitably implicit in loss and vice versa. His declared objective is not to assimilate the foreign, but to transform the self into the other. That's the way he puts it. As he states later in the text, with great insight in evaluating the translation process, a sagacity that he expresses with tones and terms that recall Schleiermacher. Quote, "Translating, transforming the self into the other to better understand the problem of the identity of the self and of the other is vital. And every good translator, in order to preserve his or her roots and as many shoots as possible, decides which dead branches should be cut. If, however, the translator is afflicted by the mania and hardliner mythomania of transplanting the entire tree from one climate to another, wholly alien climate, in terms of era, convention, language, and register, and artificially building around it a real landscape to make the mimetic effort more believable, the result, in appearance, is an integral and uncut tree that is, in substance, dead sawdust, unable to bear fruit. To successfully graft, one must prune." So if we now have a look at Busi's translation of Stead's passage, we can see that to transpose Christina Stead's prose into Italian, Aldo Busi chooses a precise dominant. Like Michael, one of Stead's characters, Busi is keen to preserve the pitch of vision that permeates the entire passage. With the precision of an entomologist, a trait of Stead's, So too, Buzi chooses to show us what happens on the page, adhering with humility to the lexical minutiae of the source text. For example, he uses testuggine for tortoise and not the more common tartaruga, which is a sea creature, whereas here a landlocked universe is described. La stolta e leggera testa of the eucalyptus for foolish light head, in which the presence of both adjectives before the noun in Italian on the one side produces a sort of sullen thrust and on the other provokes a slight smile. La stolta e leggera testa dell'eucalipto. Un universo, una verde autogenesi for a green universe, self-creative, wherein he skillfully transforms the adjective self-creative into the noun autogenesi without losing the original meaning, and the consequent shift of the adjective green. Sensi prensili for prehensile senses, semi-deiscenti for dehiscent seeds. Buzi also adheres with great care to the images of light and life. Vivida for lively, convulsivo quanto voluttuoso impulso for rushing voluptuous impulse, sfavillava for blazed, lucente for bright, brillante for brilliant. Juxtaposed to the image of nature in war, s'impennava con spinta pugnace for reared itself with a pugnacious thrust, schierate for marshaled. Buzi is respectfully attentive to the changes in the use of language. For example, creations and not creatures, translated as creazioni and not creature, and shows regard for the different rhetorical tradition from which the source text arises, which, quite unlike Italian, is fertile ground for the polysyndeton, choosing an appropriate translation, and where Stead writes, and all animal and vegetable creations were aware of the sun, wind, sky, shadow, and of their neighbors, and of the footfalls and shadows of men. Buzi translates, e tutte le creazioni animali e vegetali erano consapevoli del sole, del vento, del cielo, dell'ombra e dei loro vicini e dei passi e delle ombre degli uomini. He didn't put commas as his probably internal primary school teacher would have suggested. Minor inversions, lastly, allow him to reproduce the rhythm of the prose. Il sole sussultava, il cielo vibrava, sibilava la linfa, wherein the final chiasm in part compensates the loss suffered in the sound of the text. Buzi also knowingly decides to resort to a creative calque when he translates translucent as translucente. The Italian translation of the Latin verb translucere is tralucere. I think that the reason behind this bold choice lies in Buzi's desire to make the intratextual reference more explicit through the light that permeates the entire passage. Sometimes the temptation to calque transforms from a simple object of repulsion to a fecund threat, which lays a table of juicy fruits. In these cases, the translation gains its strength from being violently shaken by the structure of the foreign language. Translation is thus akin to walking a tightrope, suspended between equilibrium and risk. The rope vibrates, oscillates. At times the movement is slight, and at other times is strong. And the open chasm below is a risk one takes when one decides to non-conform and to challenge lexical and syntactical conventions. In his translation, Busi never steers far from the form of the final fruition and makes no concessions to translationese. That is, the language, in his words, that instead of tracing the original form syllable by syllable to convey the meaning in that way alone and no other, provides a summary of what the author intended and dumps it into the generic cesspool that is a message and communication to the undiscerning reader, thus betraying the original as well as the aesthetic energy of his or her own language and of the readers. Having identified the content and formal dominant of the passage in the picture vision with which Michael perceives the world around him, Busi honors it in his translation choices. And at the same time, he honors the irrepeatable aesthetic modulation of Christina Stead's writing. Busi loses himself in the role and at the same time keeps his distance. It is the mark of a great translator. Busi's Italian takes from Stead's prose the clearness of the images and the narrative rhythm, while laboring hard on the letter. It is a visionary power of the word that enables him to make an hour of brilliant reading vault our way, along with the phoenix shimmering pen, and thus allows us to contemplate Christina Stead's writing in Italian too. An approach only partly similar to the one Aldo Busi takes with Christina Stead can be found between Piero Jaillet and Patrick White, when in 1965 Einaudi entrusted the Italian poet to translate Voss. Stifled during the 20-year fascist rule for his political dissent, Jaillet devoted himself to translation from English as well as French, not just to survive, but also as a form of intellectual expression after having taught himself English. For Jaillet, translation was a way out of spiritual confinement. In addition to White, he also translated Stevenson, Conrad, Hardy, Green, Claudel, and Molière. He translated Voss a year before his death, and it was his last. To complete the task, he relied on the help of Meelis Rissler Stoneman, as he had done for his last translations. A recent analysis of Jaillet as a translator focuses on his version of Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1943 by Einaudi. Here Jaillet resorts to the regionalisms and popular registers typical of his personal writing style with ease. The more marked localisms, as Boccardo pointed out in his monography, reveal the desire to treat the text in a personal way, to bring the language back to a known dimension. This is essentially Jaillet's approach in his translation of Voss too. The translator makes an effort not to translate the text à la distance, but on the contrary, aims to force it to fit his own linguistic cultural system. Therefore, Jaillet essentially translates with a view towards appropriation, particularly in the dialogues and his use of deixes, a practice that was highly common in the 50s and 60s. Appropriation is present also in the use of expressions that act as a link between the various parts of the text, or in intratextual references, which often fall by the wayside, perhaps to avoid repetition. The words strictly linked to the culture of the source text are sometimes treated with a foreignizing strategy and left in English, for example, bushranger, sometimes domesticated, zibibbo for currents, the Tuscanism schiacciata for damper, and sometimes generalized, danza guerresca for corroboree. Jaillet also uses words that in all likelihood belong to his own personal linguistic repertoire, to his family sayings, such as girbe for water bags. The translation is often more explicit and rational than the source text from both a lexical and syntactic standpoint. Times the syntax is modified to be more elegant. There is an effort towards nobilization of the source text. And this when the syntax is modified to be more elegant for the purpose of good writing, was a tenet at the time and still is a tenet today for many Italian publishers. Another aspect is the scant differentiation among the various idiolects of the characters. The only voices that stand out are those of Jackie and Dugald. His spoken word is mocked, for example, by resorting to the stereotype of the primitive foreigner. He speaks using infinitive verbs. Piero Jaillet seems to struggle to break away from the translation drawl, as Busi would say, to obtain an Italian that is agile, current, alive, and respectful of the registers of the original. At the same time, Jaillet seems unable to avoid creating caricatures whose voices are ridiculed. What should guide us in the use of idiolects should not be prejudice nor a normative grammar, but rather, as Antonio Gramsci called it, a spontaneous grammar. That is how language is used, particularly spoken language. Recourse to the diamesic, diaphasic, and diastratic variations makes it possible to express the composite diatopic variety of the language without ridiculing the characters speaking that language. Voss is not only the narrative of a journey, but an interweaving of voices and stories that recount the birth of the identity of a nation, tracing through the exploration of the desert, an itinerary across the territories of the mind. However, in the novel's more descriptive parts, the writer-translator adopts a completely different approach. In Jaillet's translation, the use of adjectives is calibrated. For example, più tagliente for sharper, fulve for tawny, forestiero for foreign, affilato for lean, teso for stiff. As is the choice of nouns and verbs, cresta for crest, galleggiare for float, onda for wave, inghiottire for gulp, strabuzzare, strabuzzarono, gli occhi strabuzzarono, for eyes were bulging. There is in Jaillet the desire to maintain loyalty to the semantic fields. Crest, floated, sucked, swell, swum, grass, sea, waves of grass, waves of sleep, as well as the marked recursiveness of the passage, onde di erba and onde di sonno, for waves of grass and waves of sleep, code forestiere and cani forestieri, for foreign tails and foreign dogs, the reiteration of floated. In reading the above translation, in reading this passage, the words of Franco Buffoni come to mind. Quote, literary translation cannot be reduced conceptually to a mere reproduction of a text. It should be considered as a process which sees not an original and a copy, where the copy is subaltern to the original. So it should not be considered as a process which sees not an original and a copy move through time, but two texts equally endowed with artistic dignity. And when reading Jaillet's version of the descriptive text you have on your leaflet, this is the exact feeling. It is a text with equal artistic dignity. However, Bouzey's and Jaillet's approaches differ significantly in terms of what the mother tongue is able to tolerate when the foreign tongue demands, shakes, dilates, and mistreats it. The decision that is reached in the end, basically what we allow and what we disallow ourselves, is the stark reflection of the relationship we have with our own mother tongue. In the case of Bouzey's translation, we witness a much more dialectic relationship between the translator and his mother tongue. Bouzey, the writer-translator, pushes the boundaries much farther. In Jaillet's translation, we notice that the constrictions within which he moves in his mother tongue are much more restrictive on the writer-translator. But in both cases, we feel the desire to hand the pen to the other, to make room within oneself, to discover an imaginary world that is deeply different from one's own. And in both cases, too, we sense the moral skills, what Calvino calls that kind of doggedness that is necessary to concentrate on digging in the same tunnel for months. The key to carrying out one's task with a sense of responsibility, I would say. A task carried out with, still in Italo Calvino's words, a scrupulosity that is liable to slacken at any moment, a capacity for discernment that could suddenly become warped, start to drift, and become prey to hallucinations and distortions of one linguistic memory. That obsession, says Calvino, with perfection, which inevitably becomes a sort of methodical madness and has all the ineffable sweetness and wearing desperation of madness. And end of quote. Translation is therefore an uncomfortable place in which to work, a place where the translator has a feeling of going nowhere, of being lost. It is a place where the translator feels shrouded in a dense haze, like an autumn fog that rises up from the lake shore. It is a place where fear motivates one to escape. And yet, the translator stays there, in this place that preserves the memory of the origins, and like in the Kirikos painting, the enigma of arrival. And I would like, I think I have more or less 10 minutes. No, 2 minutes, okay, so that's fine. So this place that preserves the memory of the origins, and like in the Kirikos painting, the enigma of arrival. It is a place, as with writing, where, if one perseveres, slowly a tiny glimpse of milky light appears. Not always does what one was looking for appear, but in return, often one finds what one was not even looking for in the first place. similar to what happened to Walpole, who coined a singular word, drawing inspiration from a fairy tale set in the lush island of tea, Serendip, a drop of land in the Indian Ocean. Perhaps a place in which Australian and Italian writers can meet is this one, a place of serendipity that teaches us something about our work and about ourselves. Thank you. Thank you.